Welcome everyone to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, our name is Habitchon Istim. IDSF is the leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security-oriented policies to guide the state of Israel. We are a movement of more than 20,000 people, including many reserve officers and operators from all branches of the Israel Defense establishment. Thank you so much to all of our viewers, all of our supporters for joining into this briefing. It is very important to us that we are able to bring you these behind the headlines briefings with analysis straight here from Israel. I'm very happy to be joined today by David Weinberg. David M. Weinberg is a regular contributor to IDSF's research department and senior managing fellow at the Mizgab Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy in Jerusalem. He also is a defense diplomatic, political, and Jewish world columnist for the Jerusalem Post and Israel Hayom newspapers, and an accredited expert on Israeli and kosher wines. He was senior advisor to then Deputy Prime Minister Natan Sharansky and founding coordinator of the Global Forum Against Anti-Semitism, Israeli Prime Minister's Office. David, thank you so much for joining today.
My honor to do so.
We have a good number of important questions to discuss and a couple different topics we're going to go through and really understand a little bit deeper about what is happening now in Israel. And the first really to dive into is, as you know, long before the Hamas attack of October 7th, there has been terrorism in Israel and an uptick recently of terrorism, fueled in part by an influx of weapons, that it seems like the enemies of Israel have bullets, have guns, have very sophisticated technology from which they're able to attack Israel. And the question is, how did this happen? And what is being done about the fact that the enemies of Israel are well armed? What can you share with us?
So let's start with some statistics. There were some 45 Israeli Jews killed in Palestinian terror attacks in 2023, and about 200 Arabs in crime-related and gang violence. Despite all the IDF and Israel police counter-terror operations, the proliferation of weaponry is clearly on the sharp rise. And so is the murder rate. This is both a core security issue as well as a cardinal societal matter. It's really a crisis of monstrous proportions. Ask any government or military official just how much unlicensed and illegal weaponry is out there, primarily in the Israeli Arab and Bedouin communities or in the Palestinian areas, and you won't get an answer. Nobody knows for sure, and the estimates range from massive to berserk to insane and unlimited amounts. About a decade ago, the last concrete figure I could find, the estimate was 500,000 weapons, and since then, God knows how many more weapons are out there. It should be noted that the Revolutionary Guards in Iran earlier in 2022 boasted how they were responsible for driving weapons to Palestinians engaged both in terrorist violence as well as crime against Israel. And it turns out that our borders are quite porous. We've already seen, we've discovered in recent months, unfortunately, how much weaponry Hamas was able to amass. The border with Jordan is porous as well. There's also arms being stolen from Israeli armories. There were some 30,000 bullets stolen from an ammunition warehouse in the IDF's State Teiman base in October, and 70,000 bullets and grenades were stolen that same month from an IDF base in the north, in the Golan. And all this goes back to the beginning of the Oslo process. The dirty secret behind the untamed epidemic of weapons now plaguing Israel is that it all started with the Oslo Accords when Yasser Arafat set up 16 different competing militias, security organizations, and gave them guns. Now, at first, Israel sought to control the use of weapons in the Palestinian Authority by registering the ballistic signature of every gun and rifle that was given to the Palestinian Authority. But the Oslo era enthusiasm for quote unquote strengthening the Palestinian Authority led to more and more helter-skelter transfers of arms, and Israel soon lost track of the weapons. Today, Israeli, Arab, and Bedouin weapons economy is thoroughly integrated with smugglers, thieves, manufacturers, and suppliers, such as the Iranians, servicing both the terrorist and the criminal markets interchangeably and interdependently. As I said, this is one more sad legacy of the Oslo era.
Okay, so let's jump forward from Oslo to the present day. Is Israel doing anything to get ahead of this, to confiscate the guns, to stop these black market trade routes?
So it's clearly not enough. The same way Israel was insufficiently active and certainly not well aware enough of the extent of weapons smuggling into Gaza and weapons manufacture in Gaza. The same is true for Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. Now, under the cover of the war against Hamas over the last 3 months, the IDF has finally begun to operate aggressively and intrusively in places like Jenin and Tulkarem, both to discover weapons manufacturing facilities, to degrade terrorist abilities. But we see how difficult that has become. To go into Jenin, into the refugee camps of Jenin, the army has to go in today in full battle complement, with tanks, armored personnel carriers, combat helicopters, attack drones, almost like the maneuver inside Gaza. That's how hostile the territory has become and how well equipped the terrorists have been. Now, Israel has, as I said, acted quite aggressively in the last 3 months in a way that it hasn't done so for years. That's also true for other issues neglected ever since the beginning of Oslo, like car thefts. Everyone in Israel knows that the minute a car is stolen, it's gone into Palestinian areas in Judea and Samaria. It's either taken apart or it's pressed into service of illegal service and use, and Israel's done nothing about it for 30 years. This past 2-3 months, IDF forces have been operating in the southern Hebron area, in the Ramallah area, and elsewhere, and coming out every night with 30 to 50 stolen cars, or what's known in slang Arabic and Hebrew as mashtubot, which are basically cars that were condemned and taken off the road, stolen by the Palestinians, and then they use them for their own purpose. Even the Palestinian police forces use Israeli mashtubat. So there is something being done about this now, but the threat remains real. The problem remains significant.
And then you mentioned 30,000 and 70,000 bullets stolen from IDF bases. Can you just explain that? Because that just seems unfathomable that an IDF base has so little security that those are just stolen. How does that work?
There are Arab and Bedouin criminal gangs, both in the Negev, primarily in the Negev, but also in the Galilee, that rule the roost. Yes, they have penetrated zones and training grounds and military bases and stolen weaponry and ammunition. The issue of Bedouin criminal gangs is a much broader issue because it goes to almost all aspects of the business economy, especially in the Negev, where Bedouin criminal gangs run protection units to which almost everybody pays protection money, beginning with the major infrastructure providers, Israel Railroads, Israel Electricity Company, Mikorot Water Company, the cell phone companies, the major HMOs. They're all paying for security services, which are front organizations for Bedouin criminal gangs. And if you don't do that, your infrastructure is either stolen or destroyed overnight. It's a significant challenge to Israeli sovereignty and governance, particularly in the Negev, but also in the Galilee. It's one of the issues that became a much discussed issue over the last 6 months. Of course, now, since the beginning of the Hamas attack on southern Israel on October 7th, all these issues have sort of been pushed aside because the major focus is on, as it should be, on destroying Hamas. But it does raise another issue. Perhaps we can segue here into a second issue, which is the defense of the home front. We know that the rapid response civilian security squads in the Gaza envelope area were far and few between, poorly equipped, and were not able to stave off the Hamas invaders on October 7th. In many places, the local residents fought heroically and were gunned down, and it took many, many, many hours for real responders, IDF organized units, to enter the fray and fight back, which they eventually did. And therefore, the training and equipment of civilian rapid response squads on a massive scale everywhere in this country is more necessary and urgent than ever. And this requires both government investment and civilian, volunteer civilian mobilization. And I think the threat is real. Hamas beat Hezbollah to the punch, but we've long known that Hezbollah had plans for a broad-scale invasion of northern Israel. The Jordanian army has practiced offensive maneuvers right up to the Jordan border for months. I know this runs up against the moderate image that Jordan likes to portray for itself, but it's a fact. Israeli Arabs have rioted in recent years, as I'm sure everybody on this call knows, and blocked major arteries in the Negev and the Galilee, locking down Jewish townships. And therefore, and then you've got the Palestinian Authority itself, whose security forces, according to some investigative reporters, have been practicing turning their guns against IDF troops and even practicing invasion of Judea and Samaria settlements and beyond. There are Israeli cities and towns in the Wadi Ara era, in the what area is it? In the Kfar Saba and Rosh Ayin area, some of the industrial zones there, which are right up on the border, and they may yet need to initially defend themselves with serious training and tight incorporation into IDF defense planning. I have two colleagues at the Miskav Institute, two professors who've started to map out the zones of threat in this regard and try to create an assessment of which cities and settlements need most professionally trained and well-equipped rapid response platoons with the ability to hold off invaders for up to 6 hours. The IDF, of course, should be able to respond within 6 hours. It should be able to respond with even less than that, but at least for 6 hours. And they've made a rough estimation of the force structure required, and it is going to be a major issue as we rebuild Israel after this war.
I have a few questions to try to understand this. I guess it was about a year ago, then Prime Minister Bennett announced the formation of the National Guard, which was to be under the auspices of the Israeli Border Police. What is the nature of a National Guard versus versus these emergency defense squads? Meaning, why would the government, so to speak, endorse the creation of a National Guard, but yet at the same time, these emergency response squads were limited in their ability to defend? What's the dynamic there?
So that's a good question, and the matter is still under significant debate here in Israel, and practically nothing has been done. Bennett's proposal went nowhere. As many listeners on this call, I'm sure know, the establishment of a National Guard force was a key electoral platform and promise of the current National Security Affairs Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. And Ben-Gvir has proposed the establishment. He wanted a National Guard force separate from the police and separate from the military, almost under his direct control. That is not going to happen. A national committee that was set up to look into this has released an initial report and recommended the establishment of a National Guard adjacent to or under the control of the border police, which is sort of a paramilitary side of the Israel police, but certainly not a vigilante squad that was answerable directly to the Minister of Internal Security or National Security, which is what Ben-Gvir wanted. Is there a need for additional police or paramilitary forces to tackle Israel's internal security challenges? In my mind, unquestionably, yes. The big question is, where are all the personnel going to come from? The Israel police is grossly understaffed, and some would argue that the people it's staffed with are sort of the bottom of the barrel in terms of quality of personnel. They're not meeting their own recruitment numbers. Never mind if the Israel police or the border police were put in charge of recruiting another 9,000 to 12,000 security personnel, training and equipping them properly, and then figuring out how they interface with all the other forces that we've mentioned on this call. Is there a need for it? In my view, yes. Given what happened on October 7th, I think it will yet come into being. Government's going to have to throw a lot of money at it in order to attract better quality personnel, perhaps people after their army service who want to stay in the security field and can be attracted with a significantly higher payment to make a career out of this. There's a long way to go. One interesting, at least interesting to me, possibility, which is under discussion here, is how do you encourage parts of the ultra-Orthodox Israeli community, Haredi society, not only into the military, which is a hard sell, but into some of these civilian rapid response squads that we discussed earlier, or perhaps even a National Guard force. There are many initiatives underway to incorporate Haredi men, ultra-Orthodox men, in a range of defense and relief capacities, ranging from the rapid response squads to fire, home front command, to medical first responders like Zaka, Hatzalah, and Magen David Adom, where, as you all know, some Haredi men are already involved. The challenge is how do you make such service mainstream and honorable in Haredi society? Can you do this without forcing them into uniform. Can you do this in units that are uniquely attuned to Haredi sensibilities? For example, without the integration of women. Setting a way for their volunteer absorption by osmosis and out of uniform into some of these soft security frameworks that we just talked about. Now, nobody's arguing that this is necessarily fair or equitable, or that this truly answers the demand for equitable national security service by the Haredi community, but nevertheless, it might be realistic. It might be a way to go. In any case, the necessity of forming both the rapid response squads and the National Guard that we talked about, in my mind, is clear. And it needs to be done before Israel's other enemies copycat the Hamas attacks of October 7th.
Thank you, David. I want to ask you one more question on this before we move into our final, very important topic about Palestinians in the workforce. But just talking about the guns for a second and the rapid response teams. Do you think that the reason that there was a limitation or restriction on firearms and arming these rapid response teams is because we were living in this bubble that will be okay and therefore there's no need to arm them? Or do you think it has something to do with this is not the US, we don't have a Second Amendment, and therefore there's no default under position that everyone has a right to a gun? Can you give any explanation why there was such a lacking?
I'm pretty sure it's more the former than the latter. Second Amendment issues are not a prominent issue here in society. It's more a question of the conceptia, as we say in Hebrew, the prism, the paradigm that prevailed here for much of the last 30 years since the advent of the Oslo Accords, that we were successfully deterring our enemies without really cracking down on them, and that we could live the high-tech good life without giving a gun to every grandmother. I wrote a column a couple of months ago called Guns for Grandmothers, in which I argued that almost every able and sane citizen in this country should be armed, not just so that there are people around to respond when there's trouble, but also as a mental construct, as reminding Israeli society that we are a mobilized society with enemies out there that are really not just on all our borders, but also deep within us, both in Israel as well as Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. And I think that's a mental shift that Israel still needs to undergo.
Okay, our final topic, and unfortunately we don't have much time for this one. It's really important. The Palestinian workforce in Judea and Samaria, giving them access to much of the construction sites and all of the workforce that they provide, which is critical for the state of Israel. What is your view on that post-October 7th? What should Israel do in terms of this workforce issue?
So the IDF has arrested close to 3,000 Palestinians in Judea and Samaria October 7th attacks. About half of them is affiliated with Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and the other half affiliated with the Palestinian Authority, with Fatah and its various security organizations, which means that the threat is real. To allow back into Israel now 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 40, 50,000 day laborers from Judea and Samaria to work in Israel is, in my mind, a risk too far, an overwhelming security risk. The desire of the Palestinian public to revenge Israel's clobbering of Hamas and the many civilian deaths that have been inflicted in Gaza in the process. The desire for revenge is real. And bringing all these laborers back into Israel, in my mind, would be a mistake. Now, there are two groups advocating most strongly for Israel to nevertheless allow Palestinians back into Israel as workers, primarily in the construction industry. One is, of course, the construction industry, which has basically been shut down for the last 3 months. Everything from home building to major infrastructure projects are almost at a complete standstill. And that's a real problem for the long term. And the other group, believe it or not, are parts of the security establishment who are concerned that the pressure is building up in Judea and Samaria. You've got tens of thousands of families who have no parnasah, who aren't bringing home bread because their men worked in Israel and now they're out of work. And the only way to release some of that pressure and to help keep a lid on trouble in Judea and Samaria is by allowing Palestinians to work back in Israel. That's the argument, and it's actually parts of the security establishment that are pressing the government to allow this. I think that whether that's an accurate assessment or not, it's still a risk too significant. What Israel should be doing, and with this I'll conclude, what Israel should be doing instead is making sure that the construction industry in particular has alternative sources of labor. Israel should be bringing in significantly greater amounts of foreign workers, ranging from the workers from Thailand who work in our agricultural fields to workers from Sri Lanka, India, and other places. The cabinet has already approved a rise in permits from 30 to 50,000 permits for foreign workers. It needs to rise more. The bureaucracy involved for bringing in foreign workers needs to be relaxed. And like many Western societies, Israel will become more dependent on foreign workers, but at least they're not dangerous Palestinians from Judea and Samaria. That's a big debate underway here in Israel. The cabinet has not really made a determination. My argument, I come down on the side of not allowing, certainly in the near term, certainly as long as the fighting with Hamas and Hezbollah is underway, not allowing Palestinians to work back in Israel.
Is there any research or data supporting the notion that allowing them to work will decrease their ideologies or their propensity to violence? Has anyone done that work to figure that out?
I'm sure we could find studies to that effect. I can also point to studies that show the opposite. Yes, there are, or there were, many Palestinian families in Judea and Samaria who were dependent on either working in the settlements or working in industrial zones, such as the Barkan industrial zone adjacent to Ariel in Judea and Samaria, or traveling into Israel to work with permits or smuggling themselves in without permits. And you had, unfortunately, Israeli contractors, particularly in the building sector, who ran smuggling networks to get workers in because they needed the workers. We need to reorient our economy, gear up differently, and solve this problem.
David M. Weinberg, thank you so much for joining me and for sharing all of this. Very, very informative. Thank you, of course, to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning in today. Thank you for sending in all of your questions. We will be back with you tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.